Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Christine. As was mentioned, I'm a social media manager, and as you'll see in this talk, I have very complicated feelings about it. Actually, so this is a little bit of an offbeat talk. It's not so technical. It delves a little bit into psychology, into digital media theory, but I hope you all enjoy it. So raise your hand if you consider yourself a nostalgic person. Yeah, good. Why would you say that?
Whenever I have a good experience and a good fond memory, and then I'm reminded of it at a later date, it just always brings back even more like happy feelings than it did in the moment. I love looking back at the past.
That's really, really interesting you say that, because you'll find out in this talk why that is. Suspense. All right, so raise your hand if you've ever shared an On This Day Facebook post or a Facebook friendship anniversary. Yeah? Nice. All right. So nostalgia is an emotion so common it can feel unremarkable. However, engaging with nostalgia isn't an empty act. Nostalgia exists to nurture and reinforce essential psychological processes. And with social media platforms like Facebook adding features that service our memories, which are textual and photographic content we've shared online, and actions we've taken, like friending someone, we may ask ourselves, what does it mean to experience nostalgia in the digital age? First, let's start with the essentials. The word nostalgia was coined by a 17th century medical student to describe the anxieties displayed by Swiss mercenaries fighting away from home. It's based off the Greek word nostos, means homecoming, and algos, meaning panic. So in its origins, nostalgia was bound to geographical places, specifically places with which one felt a strong emotional attachment, such as one's hometown or childhood residence. Over centuries, the term broadened to include a wider set of remembering, from homesickness to reminiscing on events and people from one's past, and even longing for a specific era. And so, nostalgia has moved away from being a term used to describe an unequivocally negative emotion to one that is more nuanced. Nostalgia, as we know it today, can involve ancillary positive feelings, such as fondness. Historically, we've done much to stir and sustain our nostalgia. We purchase sports memorabilia, we go to 50s-themed diners, we keep scrapbooks of keepsakes, locks of hair, ticket stubs, birthday cards, etc. What hidden depths of our humanity drive these curious activities? Well, to really understand our nostalgic impulses, we need to first look at the evolved cognitive ability that nostalgia utilizes, which is temporal thought. The capacity to think about the self in time is important to survival because it allows us to reflect on our experiences, learn from them, and plan for the future. It enables us, for example, to avoid a known danger, thus lengthening our lifespan and potential for breeding and passing on our genes. It's a little morbid. So we know temporal thought is evolutionarily advantageous, but a negative consequence is that it facilitates one's awareness of one's own mortality. It turns out the ways we cope with this awareness have been studied at length. Specifically, terror management theory, TMT, asserts that people are able to live with relative mental calm by investing in psychological structures, for example, identity, meaning, and connection, that reduce this death anxiety by giving us a sense of self-transcendence. We might interpret this as a kind of immortality. Much of the research that supports TMT results from mortality salience, MS hypothesis. This hypothesis states that if certain psychological structures reduce our death anxiety, then experimentally heightening the awareness of death in a subject will result in increased levels of investment in or defense of these psychological structures. How did researchers experimentally heighten the awareness of death? By having the participants write about their own mortality or exposing them to death-related imagery, for example. In nostalgia, so we propose that nostalgia fulfills existential functions. We think of nostalgia as a positive emotional and experiential reservoir that people delve into, deal with existential threat. In Nostalgia, Conceptual Issues and Existential Functions, authors Sadikidis, Wiltshire, and Baden say that nostalgia informs and reinforces our psychological structures of identity, meaning, and connection. If this is so, then in accordance with TMT, nostalgia is, by extension, also a mechanism with which one may reduce their death anxiety. So, the idea that nostalgia helps reduce death anxiety needed to be tested, and it was. Researchers asked subjects how frequently they experienced nostalgia and how important it was to them. Then, they induced existential threats via MS and measured the extent to which participants had a sense of meaning in life. So, control participants demonstrated a decreased sense of meaning, but participants who were more nostalgic didn't demonstrate the same effects. 2 additional studies were carried out to determine the extent to which inducing nostalgia resulted in lower levels of death anxiety after MS. Consistent with foundational research showing that engagement with psychological structures reduces heightened anxiety following death reminders, one study showed that the effect of MS on elevated death thought accessibility was lower among nostalgia-prone participants. The other studies showed this also to be true among participants subjected to an experimental induction of nostalgia. 3 additional studies were done. In the first, it was determined that, unlike those high in nostalgic proneness, those at a low level responded less positively to an identity threat during MS than participants in the control condition. In the second study, at low but not high levels of nostalgia proneness, participants in the MS condition evidenced greater levels of death anxiety than participants in the control condition. And finally, in the third study, unlike those low in nostalgia proneness, those at a high level indicated greater feelings of nostalgia during MS than participants in the control condition. So, perhaps thankfully, this ends the more psychological technical part of the talk, but you'll see it all informs the context for later. So what can we say about these studies related to nostalgia? Well, they've demonstrated that after people are exposed to morbid content, nostalgia was able to keep death anxiety low and perceptions of meaning high. Furthermore, people soothe themselves with nostalgia after exposure to death-related content. This Saul Bellow quote was included in Nostalgia, Conceptual Issues, and Existential Functions, and I thought I'd add it too. So everybody needs his memories. They keep the wolf of insignificance from the door. This is actually extremely important. It's important because if nostalgia is a useful impulse that keeps us calm in the face of the most imposing truth of our existence, our eventual non-existence, while also coloring our life with meaning, then these positive outcomes are indeed things we can easily nurture in ourselves and in others. If you're feeling less generous, you can also imagine how they can be exploited. Think about what people are doing on Facebook today. They're keeping up with their friends and family, but they're also building an image and identity for themselves, which in a sense is their brand. They're connecting with the audience that they want to connect to. It's almost a disadvantage if you're not on it now. It's clear that Zuckerberg, and anyone with a stake in Facebook for that matter, wants us to spend a lot of time there. I don't mean to be crude, but the more we're on Facebook, the more ads we see, thereby increasing Facebook's ad revenue. It's business. And we know this extends beyond Facebook. The average person actually has 5 social media accounts and spends about 1 hour and 40 minutes browsing these networks every day, accounting for 28% of the total time spent on the internet. On March 24, 2015, Facebook officially launched its On This Day feature. In a brief blog post, Facebook product manager Jonathan Geller announced the feature. People often look back at old photos and other memories they've shared on Facebook, and many have told us that they enjoy products and features that make this easier. On This Day shows content from this date in the past. For example, you might see past status updates, photos, posts from friends and other things you've shared or been tagged in, from a year ago, 2 years ago, and so on. Only you will see this content unless you decide to share it with your friends. There are a few interesting things going on here. First, he implies the feature was the result of user feedback, users looking back at their old Facebook content and asking for an easier way to access it. Second, Facebook chose to first show us the memories privately. Then, we have the option to share them on our timelines. Who are these people that requested this feature? Could they be people whom, as our studies put it, are high in nostalgia proneness? And if so, are they hoping to reinforce psychological structures of identity, meaning, and connection via Facebook? And by extension, reduce death anxiety? Facebook built special rules into on this day algorithm to protect people's feelings. If it knows you listed someone as your romantic partner, then remove them. It won't show you posts including them in your newsfeed. It will also avoid displaying memories of friends who've passed away. So another thing to consider is that Facebook is offering us a curated past, algorithmically produced to favor positive moments and sanitize the negative. But let's track back to what Zuckerberg said earlier, that we use Facebook to keep up with our friends and family and to build an image and identity for ourselves. Now, if you recall, this sounds a lot like the psychological structures used in terror management theory. Interestingly, Zuckerberg calls this collection of Facebook engagement our brand. But isn't that just another word for our digital self, or even just ourself? This is really the heart of the topic here. We know how nostalgia works in the real world, but nostalgia's relative success as a mechanism to bolster our psychological structures in the context of terror management theory as it interfaces with digital spaces like Facebook, I posit, depends on whether you see your online self as a separate and perhaps even compromised entity, or if you view your online self as yourself, period. One final thought. Regardless of whether you see your online presence as the product of a separate self or as yourself, the fact of the matter is the so-called memories you make on Facebook aren't really yours. They don't live in your mind, really, the way your memories do. They also aren't material objects like keepsakes that you possess and can retrieve at will to trigger nostalgia. Your actions, comments, photos, and videos are bytes on a hard drive in a Facebook data center, and they help inform companies buying into their ad network how to show you their ads. For this reason, they are a commodity. You are, perhaps, more of a commodity and less of the brand that Zuckerberg would have you think you are. Also, it's possible for a hacker or a Facebook employee to run a command and destroy all of this. So we're engaging with a version of nostalgia that's deeply vulnerable. With this, nostalgia's existential purpose, to reduce death anxiety and add meaning to our lives, becomes ironic. Our lack of control over social media, and by extension, our psychological structures of identity, meaning, and connection, insofar as they interface with the platform, let's call them our psycho-digital structures, is in itself an existential threat. So when we use social media to engage with nostalgia, we're engaging in a fundamentally delusional process. But maybe none of this matters. Maybe at this point, we're comfortable opting into Facebook and accepting all that comes with it. Maybe in the end, Facebook's On This Day feature and others like it enable us to strengthen our sense of identity, meaning, and connection. And that can be enough. Thanks.